6 months. That was all it took for the cracks to show. The Galactic Concord had existed for over 8,000 years. It had survived wars, plagues, and the collapse of entire civilizations. Its leaders believed it could survive the loss of one species. After all, there were 42 member races. What difference could one make? They found out quickly. The first thing that broke was trade. Cargo ships that once moved freely along the outer corridors began to disappear. Pirates had always been a problem in those regions, but humans had kept them under control. Human escort fleets patrolled the most dangerous routes. Human navigators knew the shortcuts and the safe passages through asteroid fields and gravity wells. Without them, the outer trade lanes became hunting grounds. Within 3 months, piracy increased by 40%. The Drenith felt it first. They were insectoid merchants, 6-legged beings with sharp minds for profit and no talent for war. Their entire economy depended on the safe movement of goods between worlds. Now their ships were being raided weekly, and there was nobody to stop it. A Dreneth trade lord named Vrisic stood in his office on the merchant world of Kalos and looked at the numbers on his screen. They were terrible. His guild had lost 16 cargo vessels in the last month alone. Insurance costs had tripled. 3 of his trade partners had stopped sending shipments entirely because the routes were too dangerous. "We told them," Vrisic muttered to his assistant. "We told the Senate this would happen. We voted against the exile, and they did not listen." His assistant, a younger Drenath with nervous clicking mandibles, said nothing. There was nothing to say. Across the Concord, other problems were growing. On the medical world of Tessura, a research team of Valori scientists stared at half-finished datasets and empty laboratories. They were working on treatments for a disease called Veshtari syndrome, a condition that affected 3 different species and killed thousands every year. The research had been a joint project between Valori and human scientists. The humans were gone, and so was their half of the work. It was not just their data that was missing, it was their way of thinking. Humans approached medical problems differently than any other species. They were willing to take risks that others avoided. They would test experimental treatments on themselves if they had to. They combined ideas from different fields in strange and unexpected ways, and those combinations often led to breakthroughs. Without them, the research had ground to a stop. The head scientist, a Valori woman named Palara, sent a formal request to the Senate for additional funding and personnel. The Senate replied that resources were being redirected to address the communication network failures. Palara read the reply and felt something heavy settle in her chest. Meanwhile, far away from Concord space, Sam Griffin sat in a small room aboard a converted freighter and listened to alien voices. Sam had set up a mobile intelligence post during the first week of the exile. He had tapped into Concord communication channels using back doors that he had built years ago when he was still a loyal member of the Alliance. Nobody in the Concord knew about these back doors because nobody had ever suspected that a human communications officer would be clever enough to build them without being detected. Sam was very clever. He spent his days sorting through intercepted messages and his nights writing reports for Danny and Laura. What he found was troubling and satisfying at the same time. "The Concord is cracking," he told Danny one morning in the command room of the Quiet Meridian. He put a data tablet on the table. 3 minor species have filed formal protests against the exile vote. The Palathi, the Gren, and the Sulix. They are saying the vote was rigged by the Valori. The Ulani have gone further. They pulled their ambassadors out of the Senate entirely. Danny picked up the tablet and read through the reports. His face showed nothing, as usual. "What about the military situation?" Sam hesitated. "That is the bad part. The Keth Dominion is moving. They have increased patrols along the Concord border by 30%. Their shipyards are running at full capacity." Laura Bennett was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. She looked at Danny. Hank was right. Danny nodded. Get Hank. Hank Dawson was 72 years old and had fought in 2 of the 4 wars that humanity had helped the Concorde win. He walked with a slight limp from an old injury and spoke slowly, like a man who had learned that fast words often led to fast mistakes. When he entered the command room and sat down, the chair creaked under his weight. "The Keth," Danny said simply. Hank nodded. "I have been expecting this. The Keth are predators, not stupid ones either. They have been watching the Concorde for decades, probing the borders, testing defenses. They never pushed hard because they knew what they would run into." "Us," Laura said. "Us," Hank confirmed. Human ships held the most dangerous sections of the border. Human tactics won the engagements that mattered. The Concorde Navy has numbers, but they fight by the book. The Keth don't fight by the book. They fight like us, aggressive, adaptive, creative, and we were the only ones who could match them. He leaned forward. Without us, the Concorde's defensive line has a hole in it big enough to fly a fleet through. I give the Keth 18 months before they make their move. The room was quiet for a moment. Katie Morris spoke from the doorway. Nobody had heard her come in. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "Not for them, for ourselves." She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. Whether the humans wanted anything to do with the Concorde or not, the Keth would eventually come looking for them too. Strength was not optional. It was survival. But there was good news as well, and it came from Nora Vance. Nora was the convoy xenobiologist, a woman who had spent 20 years studying alien life forms and planetary ecosystems on behalf of the Concorde Science Council. She had been one of the last humans to leave the research station on Tessura, and she had taken every piece of data she could carry. Now she was studying the region of unclaimed space the convoy was moving through, and what she found made her sit down hard in her chair and stare at her readings for a very long time. "Varium," she said, when she finally called Danny. "This whole region is full of varium." Danny did not react at first. Then he understood, and his eyebrows went up just slightly, which for Danny Cole was the same as jumping up and down. Varium was the rarest and most valuable mineral in the known galaxy. It was the key ingredient in advanced faster-than-light drive systems. The Concorde had small deposits scattered across its territory, carefully controlled and heavily regulated. The Keth had a major deposit, which was one of the reasons they were so powerful, and now the humans were sitting on top of what appeared to be the largest varium deposit anyone had ever found. "How much?" Danny asked. "Enough to build 1,000 ships," Nora said. "Enough to change everything." Danny looked at Laura. Laura looked back with the first real smile he had seen on her face in 6 months. Back in Concorde space, the silence from the humans was becoming its own kind of weapon. There were no messages, no demands, no threats, no pleas, just nothing. A void where 12 billion voices used to be. Sorath, the young Vylori diplomat tasked with studying the impact of the exile, was working late in his office on the Senate station. His report was now over 400 pages long, and every page made him feel sicker than the last. Humans had been everywhere. They had been woven into the fabric of the Concorde so deeply that pulling them out was like pulling threads from a cloth. The whole thing was starting to unravel. He put his head in his hands and sat there in the quiet. On the merchant world of Kalos, Vrisic the Drenath trade lord did something desperate. He composed a private message, encrypted it with every layer of security he had, and sent it into the void along the last known trajectory of the human convoy. The message was short. "Come back. Name your price." He waited. Hours passed, then days, then weeks. There was no reply. The silence continued, and it grew heavier with every passing day. It pressed against the walls of the Senate chamber. It echoed through the empty laboratories on Tessura. It howled through the unprotected trade lanes where ships vanished without help coming. The humans had said nothing when they left. And now, that nothing was saying everything. 2 years after the exile, the Galactic Concord had still not heard a single word from the humans. Not a transmission, not a signal, not even a stray radio wave leaking from their ships. It was as if 12 billion people had flown into the dark and simply vanished. They had not vanished. They had been building. The star system the humans chose was unremarkable at first glance. A medium-sized yellow star with 7 planets, 3 of which sat in the habitable zone. No Concord species had ever claimed it because it was too far from the main trade routes, too deep in unclaimed territory, too far from anything that mattered. The humans looked at it and saw home. Danny Cole named it Haven, and the work began immediately. Within the first month, construction teams were pulling apart cargo ships and turning them into orbital stations. Within 3 months, the first ground settlements were taking shape on the largest habitable world. Within 6 months, farms were producing food, factories were producing materials, and children were going to schools built from the bones of the very ships that had carried them into exile. Laura Bennett barely slept during those 2 years. She drove herself and her engineering teams relentlessly, but she drove herself hardest of all. There was something burning in her now, a fire that had been lit the day the Concord voted them out. She had spent her entire career building things for the Alliance. Communication relays, jump gates, power stations on colony worlds. She had given her best work to species who eventually decided she was too dangerous to keep around. Never again, she told herself. From now on, everything she built would be for her own people. The varium deposits that Nora Vads had discovered changed everything. Laura's teams mined the mineral carefully and began experimenting with new drive designs. In the Concord, faster-than-light drive technology had been tightly regulated. Every species used the same basic design, controlled by patents and trade agreements that kept everyone at roughly the same level. Humans had always chafed against those limits. Their engineers would come up with improvements and then be told they could not use them because it would upset the balance. There was no one to tell them that anymore. Within 18 months, Laura and her team had developed a new generation of drives that made the Concord's technology look like children's toys. The new drives were faster, used less fuel, generated less heat, and could sustain jumps over distances that would burn out a standard Concorde engine in minutes. She showed Danny the test results in his office on a Tuesday morning. He read through the numbers in silence, then looked up at her. "How fast?" he asked. "We could cross the entire galaxy in a quarter of the time it would take the best Concorde ship," Laura said. "And we can build more. We have the varium. We have the engineers. Danny, we are not behind them anymore. We are ahead." Danny set the tablet down on his desk and looked out the window at the city that was growing below. Towers of steel and glass were rising from what had been empty land 2 years ago. Roads connected neighborhoods. A river had been dammed to provide power to the eastern districts. It looked like something that should have taken 50 years, and they had done it in 2. That was the thing about humans that the Concorde had never truly understood. When humans had nothing to lose and everything to prove, they did not slow down. They accelerated. Eddie Shaw understood this better than anyone, even though he was only 23 years old. He had been 17 when the exile happened. He remembered the day his family packed their belongings into 2 small bags and boarded a transport ship. He remembered his mother crying and his father standing very still with his jaw tight. He remembered the anger. Now Eddie was a pilot, one of the best in the new fleet. He flew patrol routes around Haven's borders in a fast scout ship, watching for any sign of trouble. He was part of a generation that had no memory of friendship with the Concorde. To Eddie, and the thousands of young people like him, the Concord was not a former home. It was the place that threw their families away like garbage. "I don't want to go back," Eddie told his friend during a meal break at the pilot barracks. "I don't care what they offer. I don't care if they beg. They looked at my parents, at my little sister, and decided we were too dangerous to keep. So now they can deal with whatever comes next without us." His friend nodded. Many of the young people felt the same way. There was a hardness in this new generation that worried some of the older humans, but Danny understood it. He had felt it himself the day the vote happened. The difference was that Danny had decades of experience to temper it. These young people had only the raw wound. Not everyone on Haven felt the anger so sharply. Meg Sullivan ran a health center in the capital city, and through her work she saw something beautiful happening alongside the pain. Families were putting down roots. Couples were getting married. Babies were being born. The first humans who would know nothing but Haven, who would grow up with alien-free skies and the knowledge that everything around them was built by their own kind. Meg delivered a baby one evening as the sun set over the western hills. The mother was a young woman who had been a university student on a Valori colony world before the exile. She held her newborn son and looked at Meg with tears in her eyes. "He will never have to prove he belongs," the mother said. "He just does." Meg smiled and squeezed her hand. That, she thought, was worth more than any Senate membership. But the universe did not care about new beginnings or healing hearts. The universe had its own plans. Back in Concord space, Sorath the Valori diplomat finally presented his report to the Senate. He had spent 2 years writing it, checking it, and dreading this moment. He stood at the central podium, the same podium where Diane Tucker had placed her translation badge and walked away, and he spoke for 3 hours. The numbers were devastating. Economic output across the Concord had dropped by 15%. 12 colony worlds were facing infrastructure failures because their power systems, water treatment plants, and transportation networks had been designed and maintained by human engineers. The communication network was still degraded, and every attempt to repair it had fallen short because nobody could figure out how the humans had built it so efficiently in the first place. Medical research had slowed across the board. Agricultural projects on frontier worlds had stalled. Cultural exchange programs had collapsed. Even the entertainment industry had suffered. It turned out that humans had been responsible for a surprising amount of the art, music, and stories that other species enjoyed. And then Sorath got to the military section, and the Senate chamber went very quiet. "The Keth Dominion has increased its fleet presence along our border by 60%, he said. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. "Their shipyards are producing vessels at a rate we have not seen in decades. Intelligence suggests they are preparing for a major offensive. Our defensive capability along the northern border has been reduced by approximately 40% since the human departure. If the Keth attack in force, we cannot hold them." The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted at each other. The Valori hardliners who had led the exile vote sat in tight-lipped silence, while species after species demanded answers. The Dreneth ambassador openly accused the Valori of destroying the Concord with their arrogance. An Ulani delegate said simply, "We warned you," and then refused to speak further. Some voices called for the humans to be invited back. Others, particularly the Valori leadership, insisted that admitting the mistake would show weakness and invite further challenges. The debate turned personal and ugly. Old alliances fractured. New accusations flew. The cracks that had started 6 months after the exile were now canyons, and they were getting wider every day. Sorath stood at the podium and watched it all happen. He felt tired. He felt sad. And deep down, in a place he did not like to examine, he felt afraid. Far from the shouting and the blame, Pete Harmon was flying a scouting mission along Haven's outer boundary. Pete was a calm, steady pilot in his 40s who had once run cargo routes through the most dangerous parts of Concorde space. Now he flew alone in the deep black, mapping the approaches to their new home. His sensor board chirped. He looked down and frowned. There was something out there, small, fast, and trying very hard not to be seen. Pete adjusted his course and ran a detailed scan. His blood went cold when the results came back. It was a Keth probe, an unmanned reconnaissance drone designed for long-range surveillance. It was scanning Haven's star system. Pete destroyed it with a single precise shot. Then, he sat in his cockpit for a long time, staring at the debris cloud where the probe had been. The Keth knew where they were. He turned his ship around and flew home as fast as his engines would carry him. When he landed and delivered his report, Danny and Hank Dawson exchanged a long, heavy look across the briefing table. "How long?" Danny asked. Hank rubbed his chin and thought carefully. "A year. Maybe less. They will want to deal with the Concorde first. But they know we are here now, and they will come for us eventually." Danny nodded. He stood up and walked to the window of his office. The city spread out below him, lights coming on in the gathering dark. Somewhere down there, Meg Sullivan was delivering another baby. Eddie Shaw was eating dinner with his squad mates. Katie Morris was reviewing construction plans for a new district. Laura Bennett was in her lab, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Laura found him there an hour later, still looking at the city. She stood beside him and asked what he was thinking. Danny watched the lights for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. "They exiled us because they were afraid of what we could become," he said. "Now I am starting to understand why." Laura looked at him. She did not ask him to explain. She did not need to. She had seen the test results from the new drive, the weapon systems, the shield generators. She knew what the humans were becoming out here in the dark, free from the chains the Concorde had kept on them for 300 years. They were becoming something the galaxy had never seen before. And somewhere out in the void, the Keth were sharpening their claws, and the Concorde was tearing itself apart. And the clock was ticking toward a moment that would change everything. But for now, the lights of Haven glowed warm against the night, and the humans kept building in silence. The Keth came on a Tuesday. There was nothing special about that day in the Concorde calendar. No warning, no declaration of war, no diplomatic ultimatum. One moment the border was quiet, and the next, 6,000 Keth warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and began tearing through everything in their path. The Concorde's outer defensive line lasted 4 days. It was supposed to hold for months. Keth's ships were ugly, brutal things, dark metal hulls covered in sharp angles, built for one purpose and one purpose only. They hit the border stations first, overwhelming the defenders with sheer numbers and savage aggression. Concorde officers who had trained for decades found themselves outmaneuvered by Keth commanders who did not follow any known tactical patterns. The Keth fought dirty. They fought mean. They fought like humans used to fight. And there were no humans there to stop them. Colony worlds began to fall within the first week. The Keth did not negotiate. They did not accept surrenders gracefully. They took what they wanted and burned what they did not need. Millions of alien civilians fled their homes, cramming into refugee ships that had nowhere safe to go, because the Keth advance was so fast that yesterday's safe zone was today's war zone. On the Senate station, the mood was pure panic. Delegates screamed at each other across the chamber. The Valori military command issued orders that contradicted each other. Fleet movements were confused and slow. The great Galactic Concorde, which had stood for 8,000 years, was stumbling like a drunk in the dark. Sorath watched it all from his office and felt sick. He had warned them. His report had spelled it out in plain language that anyone could understand. but the Senate had argued and delayed and pointed fingers instead of preparing. And now the Keth were here, and people were dying. He made a decision. Sorath walked to his private communication terminal and activated a channel he had spent the last year building in secret. It was a narrow beam transmission aimed at a specific set of coordinates deep in unclaimed space. Coordinates that he had pieced together from old sensor data, shipping records, and educated guesses. He did not know if anyone would hear it. He did not know if the humans would care even if they did. But he typed his message anyway. They are dying. Whatever you feel about us, they are dying. Please. He sent it and sat back in his chair and waited. On Haven, Sam Griffin's intelligence console lit up like a holiday tree. He read the message 3 times, confirmed its origin, checked it for tricks, and then walked straight to Danny Cole's office without stopping to knock. Danny read the message. He set it down on his desk and looked at Sam. "How bad is it?" Danny asked. Sam had been monitoring Concord communications since the day the exile began. He knew exactly how bad it was. The Keth have taken 17 colony worlds in 9 days, he said. The Concord fleet is in full retreat along the northern border. Civilian casualties are in the millions. Their command structure is falling apart. Danny stood up and walked to the window. He stood there for a full minute without speaking. Then he called a war council. They gathered in the main briefing room within the hour. Danny sat at the head of the table. Laura Bennett was on his right. Hank Dawson was on his left. Katie Morris sat across from him. Sam Griffin, Nora Vance, Pete Harmon, Meg Sullivan, and Eddie Shaw filled the remaining seats. Danny told them what was happening. Then he opened the floor. Katie spoke first, and her voice was sharp. "No," she said. "Absolutely not. These are the same people who voted to throw us into the void. They looked at our children and decided we were too dangerous to keep. They stripped us of everything and sent us into nothing. And now they want our help?" "Katie," Laura began. "No," Katie repeated. "I'd have spent 3 years helping these people rebuild their lives. I have sat with mothers who lost their homes. I'd have talked to children who wake up screaming because they remember being dragged out of their schools by soldiers enforcing the exile order. The Concord did this to us. They do not get to come crying to us when someone does it to them." Eddie Shaw nodded hard. "She is right. We owe them nothing. Let them fight their own war." The room was tense. Danny let the silence sit for a moment before looking at Hank. Hank spoke slowly, the way he always did. "Katie is right about one thing," he said. "We owe them nothing. But this is not about debt. It is about survival. If the Keth conquer the Concord, they control half the galaxy. They will come for us next. And even with our new technology, fighting the entire Keth Empire alone is not a war I want to plan for." Nora Vance leaned forward. "There is another thing," she said. "Not every species in the Concord voted for the exile. The Ulani pulled their ambassadors out of the Senate in solidarity with us. The Pelathi, the Gren, the Sulix, they all voted no. 9 species stood up for us, and now their worlds are burning too. The Keth do not care about political votes. They are killing everyone." Meg Sullivan had been quiet until now. She looked at her hands on the table and said, "I became a doctor because I believe that you help people who are hurting. It doesn't matter if they hurt you first. That is what makes us different. That is what makes us human." The room went silent again. Danny looked at every face around the table. He saw anger, fear, reluctance, and something else underneath it all. The thing that had carried humanity through every disaster in its long and bloody history. The stubborn, irrational, beautiful refusal to let people suffer when you had the power to stop it. Danny made his decision. "We go," he said. "But we do not ask for permission. We do not negotiate terms. We do not beg for readmission. We go because it is who we are. And when it is over, we come home." Laura was already on her feet before he finished speaking. She had been preparing for this possibility for months. The fleet was ready. 300 warships. They were sleek, fast, and deadly. Nothing like the bulky regulation standard vessels the humans had flown during their Concorde days. These ships were built without restrictions, designed by engineers who had been told for the first time in their lives to build the best thing they could imagine. The varium-powered drives hummed with quiet power. The weapon systems were things the Concorde had never seen. The fleet launched from Haven at dawn, 300 ships rising through the atmosphere in perfect formation, climbing into the sky like arrows shot from a bow. On the ground below, people stopped what they were doing and looked up. Some cheered, some prayed, some just watched in silence. They jumped to faster-than-light speed and crossed the distance to Concorde space in hours. A journey that would have taken the Concorde's best ships days. They arrived without announcement. No broadcast, no declaration, no fanfare. 300 human warships simply appeared on the edge of Concorde space like ghosts stepping out of a wall. The first Keth fleet they hit never knew what was happening. Pete Harmon led an assault wing of 40 ships against a Keth force that was besieging a Drenith colony world. Pete's ships tore through them in under 6 hours. The human ships were faster. Their weapons hit harder. Their shields held longer. Every advantage that 3 years of unrestricted development had given them showed in those first brutal hours of combat. Keth ships that had been crushing Concorde defenders suddenly found themselves outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outfought by an enemy they had not expected. On the Drenith colony below, civilians who had been hiding in shelters for days heard the explosions stop. They came out and looked up at the sky and saw human ships descending through the smoke. Drenith mothers held their children and wept. Drenith elders who had voted against the exile 3 years ago fell to their knees. The humans had come back. Across the Concorde, the news spread like fire. Human ships were hitting Keth forces on multiple fronts. They were liberating colony worlds. They were rescuing civilian transports. They were doing everything they used to do, but faster, harder, and with technology that made the Concorde's best look outdated. On the Valori command station, Admiral Kessoff, the same admiral who had watched the humans leave 3 years ago, stared at his tactical display. Human ship signatures were appearing across the map, and everywhere they appeared, the Keth were falling back. His aide approached cautiously. "Sir, the human fleet is requesting—" "No, they are not requesting anything. They are simply operating in our space. What are your orders?" Kessoff sat down heavily in his chair. He looked at the display for a long time. He remembered standing in this same room 3 years ago, watching the human convoy disappear, and feeling a cold dread in his stomach. He had been right to feel it. "Get out of their way," he said quietly. Far away, on the bridge of a massive Keth command vessel, the supreme commander of the invasion force was receiving reports that made no sense to him. An unknown fleet had appeared. His ships were being destroyed at an alarming rate. The tactical patterns were unfamiliar, aggressive, creative, unpredictable. Then his intelligence officer identified the ships, and the supreme commander understood. Humans. He had studied them extensively. He knew their history. He knew how they fought. He knew that the Concorde had been foolish enough to exile the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and he had planned his entire invasion around their absence. Now they were back, and for the first time since the war began, the supreme commander of the Keth Dominion felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Doubt. He stood alone on his bridge, watching red icons multiply on his strategic display, each one marking another of his ships gone dark. The humans fought in silence. No war cries, no broadcasts, no threats. Just precise, devastating violence delivered without a single wasted word. The silence, he realized, was the most terrifying part. The final battle spread across 7 star systems and lasted 9 days. Danny Cole stood on the bridge of the Quiet Meridian and commanded the largest human fleet ever assembled. 300 ships, divided into 3 groups, each one pushing deeper into Keth-held territory. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Hit them on 3 fronts at the same time, cut their communication lines, and break their will to fight. The Keth did not break easily. They were warriors, born and bred for conquest. Their ships were tough, their crews were fearless, and their commanders were smart. For every Keth vessel the humans destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The fighting was close, savage, and costly. Human ships took damage, human crews were injured, human lives were lost. Meg Sullivan worked without rest in the medical bay of a support carrier stationed behind the front lines. Wounded came in on shuttles every hour, burned, broken, bleeding. She treated them all, but then the alien casualties started arriving too. The first was an Ulani navigator whose ship had been crippled during a Keth ambush. Human rescue teams had pulled him from the wreckage without being asked. He lay on a stretcher in the hallway, his aquatic skin drying out, his gills working hard in the dry air. Meg took one look at him and shouted for her team to bring a hydration tank. After that, the alien wounded kept coming. Drenath merchants caught in crossfire, Valori soldiers whose escape pods had been picked up by human ships, civilians from a dozen species, all of them rescued by a fleet that had no obligation to save any of them. Meg did not care what species they were. She was a doctor. She helped people who were hurting. That was the job. While Meg fought to save lives, Eddie Shaw was fighting to end the war. His mission was the most dangerous one Danny had authorized. The Keth command ship was a massive vessel at the center of their fleet, and it housed the primary communication array that coordinated the entire invasion. If that array went down, the Keth fleet would lose its ability to coordinate across multiple systems. Individual commanders would be cut off from central orders. The invasion would fall apart. Eddie flew a fast attack ship with a crew of 6. They slipped through the battle lines using the chaos as cover, dodging fire from both sides, weaving between burning hulls and debris fields. Eddie's hands were steady on the controls. His heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. They reached the command ship, and Eddie brought them in close, too close for the big guns to track them. His weapons officer fired a spread of precision charges at the communication array. The explosions tore through the antenna structures and relay dishes, ripping them apart in a chain of bright flashes. The array went dark, but the Keth were not finished. Defense turrets on the command ship opened fire on Eddie's ship. A direct hit tore through the port engine. Alarms screamed. The ship spun wildly, and Eddie fought the controls with everything he had, trying to keep them alive long enough to get clear. He was losing the fight when a shadow fell over them. An Ulani rescue vessel, a big medical frigate with heavy shields, placed itself between Eddie's crippled ship and the Keth guns. The Ulani ship absorbed the fire meant for him and held position while a tractor beam locked onto Eddie's vessel and pulled it to safety. Through the cockpit window, Eddie could see the Ulani pilot looking at him from the bridge of the rescue ship. Their eyes met across the gap between the 2 vessels. The Ulani raised one webbed hand in a simple gesture. Eddie raised his hand back. Something shifted inside him. Something he had been holding tight for 3 years loosened just a little. Not all of them had voted to throw his family away. Some of them had stood up, and now one of them had just saved his life. The tide of the battle turned when Sam Griffin cracked the Keth encryption. He had been working on it for 2 years, studying their communication patterns, their encoding methods, their signal structures. Now, with the main array down and the Keth fleet switching to backup channels, the encryption was weaker. Sam found a way in. He fed false orders into the Keth fleet network. Small changes at first. Course corrections that put Keth's ships in each other's firing lines. Timing adjustments that caused formations to fall apart. Supply orders that sent fuel ships to the wrong coordinates. Within hours, the Keth fleet was turning on itself. Friendly fire incidents erupted across 3 systems. Commanders who could no longer reach central authority began making independent decisions that contradicted each other. The Keth invasion, which had been a coordinated machine of destruction, became a confused mess. Danny saw the opening and ordered the final push. All 3 human fleet groups converged on the Keth center. The fighting was intense but brief. Keth's ships, confused and leaderless, fought bravely but without direction. One by one, they were disabled, destroyed, or forced to retreat. On the bridge of the Keth command ship, the Supreme Commander watched his empire's greatest military operation collapse around him. His display was full of red, destroyed ships, lost communications, retreating squadrons. He had been outfought, outsmarted, and outmatched by the very species that the Concorde had been foolish enough to throw away. He opened a channel to the quiet meridian. His voice was flat and hard, but the defeat in it was unmistakable. Danny Cole looked at the screen showing the Keth commander's face. He did not gloat. He did not make speeches. He said 4 words. Leave and don't return. The Keth fleet withdrew. It took them 2 days to gather their surviving ships and retreat across the border into their own space. They left behind the wreckage of over 2,000 vessels and the bodies of their dead. They also left behind something less visible, but far more important, the belief that the Concorde was weak enough to conquer. The war was over. In the days that followed, the Galactic Senate convened an emergency session. The chamber was full for the first time in months. Every species was represented. The mood was heavy with shame, grief, and something that felt like awe. Sorath stood at the central podium. He was tired. He had not slept properly in weeks. But his voice was clear as he addressed the assembly. He read the full accounting of what the humans had done. Not just in the war, though that alone would have filled hours. He talked about the 3 years of exile, how the humans had taken nothing when they left, how they had flown into empty space with only what they could carry, how they had built a civilization from bare rock and determination, developed technology that surpassed the best the Concorde had to offer. And then, when the galaxy that had betrayed them was burning, they had come back without being asked. They did not demand payment, Sorath said. They did not set conditions. They did not ask for our gratitude. They simply came, fought, bled, and saved lives that we could not save ourselves. Human medics treated our wounded. Human pilots rescued our civilians. Human soldiers died defending worlds that had voted to exile them. He paused and looked around the chamber. We must ask ourselves what that says about them, and what our treatment of them says about us. The Senate voted unanimously to rescind the exile. Full membership, expanded rights, a formal apology, and an open invitation to return. The resolution was transmitted to Danny Cole aboard the Quiet Meridian. Danny read it aloud to his council. The room was quiet. Katie Morris watched his face. Laura Bennett waited. Hank Dawson leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. Eddie Shaw sat in the corner, thinking about an Ulani pilot who had saved his life. Danny drafted his reply. It was polite, it was measured, it was brief. He thanked the Concorde for the offer. He acknowledged the gesture and the courage it took to make it. And then he declined. Haven was home now. The humans had built something of their own. Something real and pure. Something that belonged to them completely. They would not go back to being a piece in someone else's puzzle. They would not submit their future to a vote ever again. But the door would remain open. For friendship. For trade. For cooperation between equals. When the Concord was ready to treat humanity as partners, rather than junior members, rather than threats, rather than pets, the humans would be there. Diane Tucker transmitted the reply herself. She sat at a communication console on Haven and addressed the Galactic Senate one final time. Her face was calm. Her voice was steady. She wore no translation badge. "You exiled us because you feared our potential," she said. "We return now not to prove you wrong, but to show you what that potential looks like when it is set free. We hold no grudge, but we will never again allow our worth to be put to a vote." She ended the transmission. The Senate chamber sat in stunned silence. On Haven, life continued. The war was over. The dead were mourned. The wounded were healing. And the living were building. Danny and Laura walked through a park in the capital city on a warm evening. Children played on the grass nearby. Ships rose and fell from the spaceport in the distance, silhouettes against a sunset that painted the sky in gold and red. Somewhere, music was playing, a guitar, something simple and old and human. Laura asked Danny if he thought the Concord would ever truly understand why the humans chose to stay. Danny watched the children running in the fading light. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe, but it does not matter. We finally understand who we are, and that is enough." They walked on together through the park as the stars came out above Haven, one by one, like lights being turned on in a house that was finally, truly, home. Decades later, a Concord historian would write about the exile and everything that followed. The passage would be taught in schools across the galaxy, studied by diplomats and soldiers and philosophers for generations to come. It read, "The humans left without a word, and in doing so, said everything. Their silence was not surrender. It was a promise that they would return, not as exiles, but as something the galaxy had never seen before. And when they did, the silence finally broke, and what it said shook the stars. The last human ship moved into formation, and the stars ahead looked cold and empty. Danny Cole stood on the bridge of the quiet meridian and watched the long line of vessels stretch out behind him through the observation window. There were thousands of them, big cargo haulers loaded with food and machines, small family transports packed tight with people who had spent their whole lives on Concord worlds, medical ships, construction barges, school vessels where children still sat in classrooms, not fully understanding why they had to leave everything behind. 12 billion people. That was how many humans were being pushed out into the dark. Danny kept his hands behind his back and his face still. He had practiced that face for weeks now. The face that showed nothing. No anger, no sadness, no fear. He wore it like armor, because he knew that every alien sensor in range was pointed at this convoy, and he refused to give them anything. Laura Bennett walked up beside him. She was his chief engineer and the person he trusted most in the universe. She had dark circles under her eyes and grease on her sleeve from working on the drive systems all night. "We are ready," she said. "All ships report green. The Borner is 40 minutes ahead at current speed." Danny nodded, but said nothing. Laura waited a moment, then spoke again. "The comm team is asking if you want to send a final message, a farewell broadcast, something for the record." "No," Danny said. "Danny, 300 years. We have been part of the Concord for 300 years. We built half their relay stations. We mapped their trade routes. We bled for them in 4 wars. You don't want to say anything?" He turned and looked at her. His eyes were calm and hard. "Let them wonder," he said. "Let them sit in the quiet we leave behind and feel the weight of what they have done." Laura held his gaze for a long time. Then she nodded slowly and walked back to her station. 40 minutes. That was all the time they had left as members of the Galactic Concord. 6 weeks earlier, the vote had happened. 31 species voted yes. 9 voted no. Humanity was to be exiled, expelled, removed from the alliance they had helped build. The official reason filled 10 pages of diplomatic language, but it all came down to one word that nobody said out loud: fear. Humans learned too fast. Humans adapted too well. Humans took alien technology and improved it within a generation. Humans went from being a junior species to competing with civilizations that were 10,000 years older. And that scared the powerful races of the Concord more than any enemy fleet ever could. Tall, proud, crystalline-skinned beings who had ruled the Concord for centuries. They looked at humanity and saw their own future irrelevance staring back at them. So they built a coalition. They called in favors. They twisted arms. And when the vote came, they won. Danny had watched the broadcast of the Senate session from his quarters. He had watched Diane Tucker, the human diplomatic attaché, sit through the entire vote without moving. When it was over, when the numbers appeared on the display and the chamber fell into an awkward silence, Diane had stood up slowly. She removed her translation badge from her collar and placed it gently on the podium in front of her. Then she looked out at the assembled delegates. Hundreds of alien faces, some ashamed, some relieved, some too cowardly to meet her eyes, and she turned around and walked out. She did not say a single word. Danny had heard later from sources inside the Senate that her silence had shaken the room more than any speech could have. An Ulani ambassador, one of the aquatic beings who had voted against the exile, whispered to a colleague, "That silence was worse than any threat." Good, Danny had thought when he heard that. Let it be. Now Katie Morris was speaking to the convoy. Not to the galaxy, not to the Concord, just to her own people, through internal channels that no alien ear would hear. Katie was the civilian council leader, elected by the people to speak for them. She was a small woman with a strong voice and a spine made of iron. "I know you are angry," Katie said over the comm. Her voice reached every ship. "Many of you were born on Concord worlds. You went to school with alien children. You worked beside them. Some of you loved them. And now they have told you that you are not welcome, that you are too dangerous, too different, too human." She paused. Danny listened from the bridge. "We will not beg," Katie continued. "We will not rage. We will not look back through the window and cry for people who threw us away. The galaxy made a choice today. Now they will learn what it means to exist without us holding the seams together." Across the convoy, people listened. Some cried quietly. Some held their children. Some stared out windows at the stars they were leaving behind. But nobody broke the silence that Danny had ordered. Nobody sent a message to the alien worlds they had called home. The discipline held, and there was a strange power in it. The border arrived. On every screen across every ship, a small indicator changed. They had crossed out of Concord space and into the unclaimed regions beyond. Just like that. 300 years of membership, of building, of serving, of bleeding, ended with a quiet line on a map. And then Sam Griffin did what Danny had told him to do. Sam was the communications officer, a quiet man with clever hands and a mind for systems. He had spent the last month preparing for this moment. At Danny's signal, he pressed a single command into his console. Across the entire Concord, every piece of human-built technology went dark at the same time. Relay stations that carried faster-than-light signals between star systems shut off. Deep space sensor arrays that watched for threats went blind. Communication nodes on colony worlds lost power. Navigation beacons along trade routes blinked out. Emergency broadcast satellites fell silent. The humans had not destroyed anything. Every piece of equipment was intact. They had simply turned it all off. In one moment, the Galactic Concord lost 23% of its communication network. On a Valori command station near the galactic core, alarms began to sound. Officers scrambled to understand what was happening. Reports flooded in from every sector. A Valori admiral named Kesoth stood in his war room and watched the tactical display flicker as entire regions of space went dark. "What is this?" he demanded. "The human systems, sir," an aide said, her voice shaking. "They have all gone offline. Every single one." Kesoth stared at the display. The holes in their network were enormous. He had never realized how much of the Concorde's backbone was built by human hands. Nobody had. It was the kind of thing you never thought about until it was gone, like the air you breathe or the ground beneath your feet. He sat down slowly and looked at the screen where the human convoy had been. Beyond sensor range. Vanished into the empty dark without a word. "Why does this feel like we made a terrible mistake?" Kesoth said to no one in particular. His aide did not answer. She was thinking the same thing. Out in the black, the human convoy flew on, in silence. Danny Cole stood on the bridge of the quiet meridian and watched the stars ahead. Behind them, the galaxy they had helped build was already starting to feel the cold. And the humans had not even said goodbye.